Sandy, firstly, thank you so much. It's great to see you in good health, and I hope your family is all doing well. So for me, it's an honor and privilege to be invited by you. So thank you. At the Global Institute, we are all fine, touch wood. Our KL office obviously is following the Malaysian lockdown. So all our staff in KL are working from home. But in Hong Kong, we don't have a lockdown. So we've all been coming to work every day. Clearly, our projects have all, particularly our field projects, have all been postponed. But our pain is small compared to the people, hundreds of millions around the world, who are suffering a lot more, particularly those at the lower end of the economic ladder. So we count our blessings. We're lucky and privileged, but we try and work hard and make a positive contribution. Thank you for asking.
May we know how many cases in Hong Kong and what prompted the government to take a more progressive approach in terms of keeping the economy open, keeping things more business as usual?
Yeah, the numbers in Hong Kong are very low. I think it's less than 100 or so. It's not a lot at all. But the government was very careful, and this is a very interesting situation in Hong Kong. The people of Hong Kong, as you know, last year, we had 6 months of social unrest and all of that. So everything was in turmoil. And then there was Christmas, and there was a bit of a lull. And then things started to happen in January. And interestingly, the people of Hong Kong started to take it upon themselves to be very precautionary about what was happening. So the government didn't have a hard job trying to tell people you have to be careful. They were very, very careful. And in the initial days, and I will admit myself, I thought there was an overreaction because everyone was running around trying to find masks. I would come to my office at 8 o'clock, and there's a pharmacy downstairs, and there'd be a queue of about 1,000 people.
Wow.
And I used to think, oh, this is the Hong Kong obsession with queuing to get something, right? But in retrospect, it was looking in hindsight, it looks like people were essentially taking matters into their own hands to protect society in general. And so the Hong Kong government really had a very good rapport with the community. And of course, our city is small compared to some place like Jakarta. And of course, different economic status as well, standing. But then the government has very good experience from SARS from 17 years ago, and the community. So everyone cooperated. And then to answer your question, in the last month, the government was extra careful because there were many returnees. Ironically, Hong Kong people living in the US, and particularly the UK, who returned, funnily enough, fleeing Europe and the USA to come to a safe place, which was Hong Kong. Whereas in August last year, everyone was saying Hong Kong is not safe. So it's the irony of life. So there was a bit of a spike, and the Hong Kong government essentially then put in careful measures. And to finish off my remarks, I think one of the things the Hong Kong government was very careful about is to not create, as you and I, were exchanging earlier, not create too much fear.
Right.
Which is to keep calm.
Which is very important during the crisis, is to keep calm.
Yeah.
And not that many people now remember what happened in Hong Kong in 2019.
Exactly.
I remember mid of 2019, Hong Kong was almost every day in the news because of what's happening with the demonstrations and so on and so forth. And with that, so many connections to Hong Kong with the epicentrum of Wuhan, people were sort of like expecting that Hong Kong would be impacted the most. But now that you see, it's Singapore, it's South Korea, you even see the United States of America now have more cases than any other country, Europe as well. And this is something that I would want to share with you with some slides. It's going to be very quick slides, but it probably would assist our conversations if Pak Radit can start the slide. The keyword that Pak Chandran mentioned is how to keep calm, because it is a unprecedented time. People have never ever experienced this in their lifetime. The last pandemic of such a global scale was Spanish flu in 1918. You know, SARS happened 17 years ago. Some countries get it, but most countries have not been affected by it. But this is truly global. If you look at the next slide, this is something that you mentioned. Almost 2 million people now in 185 countries is a new normal. And it's actually very abnormal that you see the red spots are within the US and not so many red spots in near China, actually. If you look at more red spots are in the Europe. So if you look at Europe zone, North America, you know, we would not feel that this would be the, I guess, the areas that will be impacted the most from a virus that actually originates from a Wuhan wet market. So many of us feel unprepared. It's COVID-19, I think, draw its own trace to global pandemic map. And if you look at the response so far, I guess because we are at war, the next slide, this is something that actually leadership that we want in time like this.
Yeah.
Geopolitics aside, but Churchill in 1942 actually flew to Russia to meet with Stalin and then map some of the efforts that they could do together in order to face the upcoming World War II. And the ideological differences could not be, you know, further apart. Now, the response for this particular war that we're having is very, very different than what we are seeing leadership at the Second World War. Right now, President Trump and President Xi, yes, they did talk over the phone, but the efforts globally, it's not really coordinated. We have not really identified decisive points and concentrate everything in this fight together.
Yes.
If Churchill is leading this effort, he would make sure that everybody is focusing on the battlefront and not talk about anything else. So rather than getting distracted, geopolitics or even domestic politics contests, you need to fight and focus all your resources to this great battles that need strategic discipline. So I'll be very quick. The next slide is the
I can't hear you. Is it our side or theirs?
I think there's some internet connection problem in Pak Sandi's house.
Like static.
That means he's from...
Hello? Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay. Let me check with Pak Sandi. With Pak Sandi, sorry.
I can't hear you.
Hello.
Yep, now I can.
Yep, yeah. We are waiting for Pak Sandi.
Okay.
I think there is some connection problem in his house.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you. I can hear him. I can see him, but he's not moving.
Okay. I cannot see him anything.
No, I can see him static only.
Okay.
But this is recording, right? Not live, huh?
Yeah.
Okay. It's his side, yeah. If it's ours, I would be frozen. Yeah.
I'm so sorry we got cut off. There is a power outage at my home.
Now I got you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Since the COVID-19, I guess there are a few disturbance. So I'm sorry, but I'm back on a temporary power solutions provided by a Chinese-made genset. So this is really how globalizations have really aided where we are. So going back to the slide, I guess we want to make sure that the curve is not that deep,
yeah,
and the time elapsed will not so long. So the fee curve, I coined this term Economies. So basically,
oh, okay.
So you need to have government come up with a package that makes sure that it will limit the economic impact. It provides the stimuli, it provides the rescue, in particular with the people on the bottom part of the pyramid.
Yes.
It needs massive government interventions. We have issued a $28 to $30 billion package, which focus on healthcare, SMEs, as well as direct cash transfers to the unemployed. However, a lot of people have said that it's not enough. We need to go as high as probably 100 to 150 billion US worth of economic package. Because now, after 4 weeks of the large-scale social limitations, people have not had their daily incomes, I guess their regular routine daily incomes for the last 2 to 3 weeks. So we are seeing some pain in the economy. Yeah. So the last slide is basically, I want to discuss more on how to survive, because we want to inject some optimism to this. So this is where the slide that I share with some of my SME class and some of the mentees that I have mentored, that crisis, that especially this COVID-19 pandemic trend, the first step is to have a mindset that cash is king. When the pandemic began, you have limited mobility. You have to make sure that you preserve cash.
Yeah.
You renegotiate your cash outlays.
That's right.
To adapt to new normal, because now businesses who are in the health services, health supplies, health sectors actually boom. People now that Wi-Fi is in demand, people in technology, in electricity, as well as providing webcam, the Wi-Fi, and so on and so forth is actually booming. The vitamins business, jamu, you know jamu, right?
Yeah, jamu, yeah.
Jamu for increasing your immunity is actually growing. People who are producing this face mask is growing, and a lot of people are now converting some garment factories into producing massive amount of face masks. So this is what I would call adapting to new normal. The third phase is what you described earlier, which is stay calm in the storm. You don't risk yourself fighting the storm. You'll get drowned. And you make sure that you wait till you hunker down, wait till the storm is over. You make sure that the peak is being handled. And you would system that that you get from combinations from government support and from friends and family supports, as well as the private sector support. And the final phase is survive through ecosystems. You are normalized and you get together and then see from post-COVID, people say that there won't be going back to normal. There is no more going back to normal pre-COVID-19. But post-COVID-19, it's a new normal. It will be crystallized and we will do things differently. People will be more responsible. Government will be stronger, as your book have suggested, that government will make sure that it's a sustainable state by strong government, because government will lead the private sectors to make sure that they have responsible environmental practices. Now we see Jakarta with blue skies, never seen before. 10 years, you know, or 20 years. You will see social impact being thought very carefully, like the healthcare. We just realized that we have been underinvesting in
right.
And also on the governance, that the private sectors have pretty much have free hands so far without really good guidance. So I thought about your book, and
Thank
that's
you.
why I want patience with you. And before I turn it back to you for your thoughts and for your, I guess, inputs during this crisis, I want to remind everybody in the last slide that we need to continue to be active. The last slide is to remind everybody to continue to work out. Even you're at home, you run around the house, you lift weights, you burn calories for at least 30 minutes. That keeps your optimism, and hopefully together we will get through this COVID-19. So again, I'll pass it to you, Chandran, and would love to hear your thoughts and inputs, how to be calm and how to be optimistic dealing with this COVID-19.
Well, Pat, thank you. After your extremely clear outline of what is happening and how to deal with it through the different stages, I'm not sure I have a lot more to add, but perhaps I can just share some thoughts in my mind too, that you, by you outlining this, is triggered in my mind as well. And I think, in fact, just today I've written a piece, which I think you will find interesting, at least in the title. I said the piece is entitled, "It Took a Virus to Reinstate the State," right? To bring back the idea that, of course, we need businesses, we need markets, etc. But we went so far extreme that we forgot that order, and which is what we need now, and we are being reminded, order can only be essentially put in place through the institutions of society, and that's the state. And so now we're seeing, even in Europe, and particularly in the United States, a reckoning that so much of this discussion over the last 30, 40 years, based on ideology, has essentially crumbled in the space of 2 months. People have realized that without order, which cannot come from hoping markets will produce, free markets will produce that, we are actually in chaos. So, I think you're absolutely right. So what do I know? For me, hopefully, and I think you will agree, that there's a difference between advanced economies and developing economies. There's a difference between a large country like Indonesia with over 250 million people and say a small country like Laos, you know, it's different. So I think there are real differences, but for me, there are certain things that we should expect in the new normal that you say should be crystallized. And that new normal should be shaped by very, very clear policies made by the governments. And those policies, and therefore, they reorientate the nature of investments. What is the priorities, etc. And I think I sent you the piece I wrote about 2 weeks ago saying that there is no anti-globalization because globalization is essentially the world we live in. The question is which parts of globalization we need to manage in a way that allows us to essentially address what something like this has exposed as a problem. And I named 2 areas, and I think this is very pertinent to a country like Indonesia. The first one is, as we talked about health, right? We should not be depending on basic health care and also health wellness on imports of drugs and all of those things, right? So I gave an example in the longer piece that this whole discussion about ventilators has become a ridiculous discussion on the sense that most of the poorer countries can't afford these ventilators because they're so expensive. Yet coming from an engineering background, the mechanics of a ventilator, not that complex. So in Indonesia or say in Bangladesh, we don't need the 50,000 digital remotely controlled satellite-enabled ventilator. Yeah, we need a simple ventilator that can be operated, and the level of competence also allows local people to manage them. And these can be built locally, without the doubt. Indonesia has the engineering capability to do this. So I think that's one area of healthcare. And then you mentioned the mask and all of that. So governments really need to shape the private sector. Certain things we will make in country because they are essential. Down to even my view, sanitizers. You know, using local materials, local plants. Let's do research and development. The biodiversity of Indonesia is one of the richest in the world. Let us create R&D that looks at the richness of the biodiversity and then looks at how we create this. And I'm not saying multinationals should be pushed out or whatever, but there is a need for self-sufficiency on that. So that's one area that I think, from ventilators down to sanitizers, down to masks, down to protective clothing. All of these can be done in a developing country, no problem. The other area I think that is really important, and we're already seeing, is as ports get blocked in supply chains, we created a globalized world in which some of the supply chains sort of systems that we all got fascinated with because they became business case studies are actually too complex, too reliant on weak links, etc. And as soon as something happens, boom. And there's always on-demand supply. So one area I think developing countries really need to look at is food, right? So I'm not sure if Indonesia is self-sufficient in rice, but I know Malaysia is not. But there's no reason Malaysia should not be self-sufficient in rice. Absolutely no reason. And you're a financial guy. You understand these things better than me. And a country like Malaysia or Indonesia or Southeast Asia should not be held ransom to the volatility of market prices for basic commodities, which we can grow.
Right.
Right. So then we start reversing this view that farming is a poor man's thing, that only the uneducated farm and all of us get educated and move to cities, and then we do something else. But actually we change that and make farming actually a very important part of our economy knowledge-based, very well managed, and priced properly so that the farmer is not the weakest link in our chain, which is why so many, as you know, then can't live in the countryside, they come to the cities. So I think those are very fundamental things. I think healthcare, self-sufficiency. It doesn't have to be the rocket science gadget. It should be fit for purpose locally. And the second one, I believe, is food. And then the last point, and I'll stop because I have a lot to say about this, but the other point I think becomes very important are big questions. How big should our cities be? Is mega cities the future, given the proximity of people living in such congested areas? Should we have a different way of now looking at how our large populations live? And therefore looking at what I call a network of secondary towns that support the rural sector and therefore the whole food supply thing as well. So that's another thing I think about. And finally, as we all know, hygiene is becoming very important. So the good side, I think the new normal will be, everyone will be aware of the importance of hygiene. That can only be good for humanity, can only be good for us. So when we look at hygiene, obviously related to that, because I come from the engineering water background, two things matter. You need adequate supply of water.
Water.
Right? And that needs to be priced and properly provided for everyone as a basic human right. So I talk about that in my book. That is a basic human right. That is an investment, again, to your point, government should think, what do we invest in? Well, clean water for everyone is a must. And of course, when we have clean water, we use water, then there's a pricing mechanism to make sure people don't abuse it.
Right.
Right, so you price it accordingly. And then the other part of it, of course, is sanitation. And the sanitation is not just the toilet, it's all the water we use, because if you're washing your hands, you're washing it because you're trying to get rid of the virus or the germs or whatever. They go down somewhere. In too many of our countries in Southeast Asia, they go down some drain, into some river, into some pond, and we don't treat. So I think a priority for Southeast Asian countries, and because of our climate as well, is infrastructure around water, wastewater disposal is fundamental to hygiene. And you know better than me, that creates a whole new economy, lots of jobs. And then when I talked about sanitizers and the R&D, I mean, that again is new economy. And then a new economy around local foods and staples.
Right.
To feed people. So, you know, those are the things I would respond to that can be part of the new world and the new model that our government starts to think about. And I've also just written a piece, finally, a last piece, which I won't elaborate too much, but we also now have an opportunity. As we know, the virus came from and we don't know exact which animal, but it was essentially transmitted from animals to humans. And the two animals at the moment being identified as the source, one is what is called the Malayan pangolin, and the endemic to our region, Malaysia, Indonesia.
Indonesia, yes.
Yeah, and the other one is a bat.
Yeah.
Right. So one of the things I think we should do is ASEAN, and you have a powerful voice to influence, ASEAN should take the lead now and say, because China has just put in a total ban. So I know a senior person in the Chinese infrastructure who is essentially been advocating bans because they come from the conservation. And he said the one silver lining, the good news from this is the Chinese government has said total ban. And you know when the Chinese say, we're going to shut you down, they're going to shut you down.
They are going to shut you down.
They're going to shut you down. They will find you. But one of the things we in Southeast Asia need to think about is actually a lot of the exotic animals that turn up in Chinese markets are from our kampong areas.
That's right.
Come from our hutan, our forests.
Right.
So we now in ASEAN have a responsibility to stop it, not simply because we are environmentalists, but I think we should say no more of our pangolins should be slaughtered and put on plates. Our economies are advancing, etc. there's a different discussion about indigenous people. I think we all know that. But no more should we be feeling that people in our countries should be having their livelihoods, particularly poor rural areas, based on hunting for wild animals to be sold in markets that go to urban areas for consumption or semi-urban areas. This is not in our interests. And then secondly, it has a huge economic impact. So if our government officials can think of two things, the economic costs, because the next one, if we are not careful, can come from another animal. So we have to be careful. So ban it. Therefore, rural development needs to be different so that poor people do not feel they need to go and hunt animals to sell to a middleman who then sends it over to whatever capital. And the third thing, it preserves our very important heritage, which is our ecology. And lastly, it's a very fundamental economic argument because we cannot afford, as you say, this unprecedented lockdown. We can't. So those are the things that are on top of my mind in terms of, I see this as positive things. Stay calm. This will go away. Now do all the things, learn what we learn from this, and our societies will be stronger and better for that.
You ran few scenarios in your program and in your class, that deals with young leaders for tomorrow. Have you guys ever run scenario planning that involved something of this nature, a worldwide global pandemic before?
On a pandemic, no, we never did that because our projects tend to be the scenarios around a particular local issue and a possibility to make a transformation there. I mean, we did a program in Sabah last year, which was about hydroelectric schemes, but fundamentally then related back to the preservation of the ecosystems, because if you want hydroelectric, which is to do with, of course, not using carbon-based sources for energy, then you need the ecosystems to be functioning. And so we did an interesting piece of work. The recommendations are with the Sabah government on essentially putting a price on ecosystem services, right? So that every ecosystem service is priced into any economic decision, because we don't live, of course, we can't turn the clock back. There will be need to exploit some natural resources. I think we all know that. But we need to price it in a way that the ecosystems are essentially valued and certain decisions have to be negated because the price is too high. So those are the things. But we didn't do a pandemic scenario.
Pak Chandran, assuming that you are advising our good friend, Pak President Jokowi now, with so many limitations that the government have, with such a large, close to 20, 25 million people live around Jakarta and Java. It's so heavily, densely populated. Now, Ramadan is coming, and people who are working in urban areas have this annual pilgrimage to Balik Kampung, to go back to their village. And this is almost the ritual that is so religiously followed. As you know, we have this COVID-19 pandemic going on during this Ramadan, which is going to take place. The month of Ramadan is 10 days away, and 30 days after that is the Eid al-Fitr. Now, what would you advise? Because the government is sort of like in the middle now. They are saying that, no, you should not go mudik, you should not go balik kampung. But in a way, they are also not saying that you are not allowed to balik kampung, at least from the implementations out there, that people still can go in and out Jakarta and surrounding areas. Now, given your scenario planning and all your sort of like settings in the class before, what sort of like advice it would be pertinent at these situations that could be, I know it's going to be, a lot of assumptions there, but Chandran Nair, what would you advise Pak Jokowi?
But firstly, I'm not sure I'm qualified, but since you asked me, I pretend to be qualified and think of what I would think about. I think the first thing, Mark, is we are literally, I think, 4 weeks away from maybe people start to balik kampung, right? Because, Ramadan starts. So it's about 4 weeks away from people balik kampung. So my first view would be to take all measures at the moment to thoroughly lock down as hard as possible. And then, as you and I talked, and I'm not an epidemiologist, but just watching, and I have a bit of microbiology background, etc., is to look at the data, and we know it's testing. But you know better than I do, the chances that Indonesia can do the levels of testing to get reasonably statistically valid numbers that show what is the level of infection, etc., is going to be almost impossible in the next 4 weeks. And that is not to say Indonesia is not capable. One just needs to look at the United States to know how difficult it is if one is not totally prepared. So I would think, watch very carefully, do everything now to tell the people we have to lock down. And then provide all the social assistance that you talked about, particularly for those at the bottom of the pyramid, those who will typically want to go balik kampung, because it might be the once in a year opportunity to see families on other islands, etc. And as we get to the week 3 before Eid, or 2 weeks, or the week before, really take a critical look at the numbers. If the numbers don't look like that they are flattening, then the only thing I know is I look at who got it right. And that is Chinese, Wuhan. Same situation, Chinese New Year. And the Chinese pilgrimage during Chinese New Year is the biggest movement of human beings in the world.
Yes.
Right?
Almost similar, but we're at a smaller scale.
Smaller scale. So you have something on your side. And if the numbers look okay, then that's a political decision with scientific advice that the president needs to take with his advisors. But if the numbers are not absolutely reassuring, then my view would be complete lockdown. And then provide all the services during the Eid period to people to feel that they are cared for, there's no resentment, and everyone understands. But I think that communication needs to start now. People know what the scenarios are. So people get 6 weeks to get used to a possibility, complete lockdown for the sake of the nation. Right? And then, but maybe we can go home. But that communication, and you're the great communicator, as a former, deputy governor, etc., that is the important thing. How you say that, you guys are the experts. But that needs to start now. So people are prepared. People are totally prepared for this. And so that's my view. Look at the numbers, let the science talk, get the people ready, get them to understand that this is not arbitrary stuff. This is numbers, data. And even the most people who typically not informed of science, they can read graphs. Right? They can see, get this out, and then people understand. And that's how I would play it, and make it very clear. But the evidence is that China took a very hard decision, Chinese New Year the week before, and clamped down. And I don't know, Pa, if you know, but this might also be of good information for the Indonesian government. But there's a very recent science paper produced last week, which I'm sure you can find, but otherwise I'm happy to send, which suggests that, although some criticism of China being 3 weeks late, etc., but people forget that almost every country in the world, when there was a disease of this sort, could not anticipate. You know, HIV was 6 months in the US. I think mad cow disease in the UK was more than 3 months before it really came out. But the evidence in the recent paper is that the Chinese government, by doing a complete hardcore lockdown, probably saved something like 75 million people may perhaps be affected around the world.
Wow.
That. So I think that's the kind of evidence to use, communicate to people, and then if people hunker down, do the hard things now, there's a chance.
Right, right.
No chance. And prepare to make people happy during that period with other things that we can do to get them to not feel it's totally unfair, but they can also feel patriotic to the nation, do something like that. But that's the role of the communicators like you.
Right. Well, we are almost running out of time. My last questions to you is that I read somewhere that post-COVID-19, that there will be rearrangement of what you mentioned earlier, the global supply chain, whereby the two leaders will be the US and China. And you, because of the politics, and I don't know what's going to happen with the US elections, but if they're following the same trajectory, Japan has already offered some loans for company to relocate out of China. Now, people may think that it is, you know, opportunity as well for Vietnam, for Indonesia, for Malaysia to get some of this relocations into their countries. But I am very concerned if the reactions of world leaders when it comes to, you know, post-COVID-19, that they would do things on their own rather than cooperate. What would your thoughts be post-COVID-19? How to ensure that world leaders would not basically focus on creating, because we are on the verge of maybe going into the second Cold War with China and the US if the trajectory is going this way.
Well, Pat, that's a very important question. And it's interesting because the China-US conflict has been going on for about now 2 years. And then it hit this particular global pandemic. It's essentially unprecedented. Put that in context. So I think there's a couple of things here. I think at this point, and I think most people will agree, without wanting to take sides, we have a very combative, nationalistic leader in the US. That is unfortunate. That is very unfortunate. I don't think you need to be pro-China or anti-China to understand that the Americans instigated this conflict with China. China, I think, on the other hand, has to wake up that its rising power is a concern to some, right? And I'm, in my view, particularly looking at Asia, I think we in Asia will know how to deal with China. I think that's going to be very important. This is not stated enough. And I think we in Asia, there are cultural issues, we know how to deal with China. And I think the Chinese know how to deal with us, right? That is not to say that we will all not have our separate economic interests. But I think the US head-on taking on China in this way, and the European paranoia, needs to be put in the context of the geopolitical shift from basically a Western-centric world order to a post-Western world order. And we are living through that. There is no changing that. So, you know, as you know, I've written that if it was not China, but India had got its act together through whatever, it would be the Indians. So I think the rest of us need to understand that it's very difficult for the Western world to come to terms with this post-Western world. And at the moment, the USA is being very belligerent. Now, if Trump doesn't win and someone else comes across, I think absolutely there would be a toning down. But it not change the course of the tension between a new non-Western power for the first time in 400 years, essentially being accepted in the new order. This is difficult. So the Europeans, I think, understand it better, but the Americans don't. So much depends on leadership. But coming back to our region, I think ASEAN, and the big brother of us in ASEAN is Indonesia. We need to play an important role in speaking about this new order in, as you say, always a constructive, calm way, creating a narrative, because as you know, the ASEAN population will be close to 1 billion in 25 years.
That's correct.
We are a very powerful bloc. And so I think despite some differences, ASEAN is not too bad. We got many things to do, but we can be a good, reasonable bloc that voices the concerns of 1 billion people and put that on the table. But your point in your question is global cooperation is so important. But there's no substitute, on the other hand, for local action to make things better at home. So global cooperation doesn't mean we simply have to obey misguided, misdesigned supply chains that then force Malaysia to buy rice from the USA. It is not protectionist if Indonesia says, no, we're going to grow all our rice. Yeah. And that's okay, right? But the other areas we need to cooperate. And that's the fundamental thing. So leadership is important. And I think Indonesia has got a really important role to play in this because of your whole multifaceted, peaceful culture, and to lead us because you have that, and to lead us and lead ASEAN with all the other countries to say to the West and China, hey, there can be a different way. But the American leadership at the moment is too belligerent. And I don't think I'm being unfair by saying that. Something needs to change there. Otherwise, we'll have this tension.
Right. Final thought on, you wrote Consumptionomics.
Yes.
What's the future of consumptions after COVID-19? Given, I just read somewhere that the first day of either Louis Vuitton or some very, very upscale brand, first day opening in China, $2.7 million of sales, which is completely mind-blowing. So my final questions to you: what's the future of consumptions in Asia, in the world post-COVID-19?
I think there's some discussions in the West that consumption levels will reduce because people have learned certain things. And in my book, the second book, I said that consumption will rise in the world because, as you know, those who are not consuming, the bottom of the pyramid, like the majority in Indonesia, they will need to consume the basics. The question is, what do they consume? And which way do we spread our economies that they are consuming the important things? So, for instance, if you look at some of the people most predisposed to being very sick with COVID, the data suggests that it's usually people who are unhealthy, diabetes, overweight, etc. So, if I just look at food, I think the future is government policies, very clear, education, that I'm writing a piece at the moment saying that gluttony, overconsumption is not a human right, right?
It should be outlawed.
It should be outlawed, but not just outlawed, but the piece, when it is published, I was saying it has links to climate change, it has links to biodiversity, it has links to water, and then it is health. But we have a food production system today that essentially is a free market one, in which everyone who has the ability to purchase, doesn't mean they are rich, purchases an overload of food, much of which for the poorer classes are actually unhealthy. So if you look in the USA, the data of, is showing that in some of the places, the Black population or Hispanic population is 30%, but the death rates are 70. The ugly truth is bad diets.
Right.
Poorer people eating bad food. And we know this even in our own countries, right? People eating instant things and all of that. In our countries where, we can grow vegetables. So how do you refine those supply chains, etc.? So from my point of view, consumption, I think a basic consumption needs to lift the poor people of Asia will continue so that the emissions of consumption will increase. That's the book. That's what I suggest in the second book. But the question is, governments need to make sure that there is a trade-off between their need to consume their basic needs and the impact on the externalities on the environment. But on food, I think this is a golden opportunity now to prevent overconsumption and to really get into not some hippie organic food for middle upper class people buying stuff in supermarkets, but for everybody to have access to essentially good food that is produced locally. And you don't need to eat large quantities as well. And that's the education side, I think. And so that's, for me, is the big challenge. And I was asked the same question 2 weeks ago on a thing I did by someone in China saying, hey, we opened up and people are back to consuming. But I said, you can't expect this to change overnight. The governments will need to start to intervene with policies. So it's a long answer.
Pak Chandran Nair, you have been so generous with your time. I would like to thank you for spending the last 1 hour with me. We'll continue the conversations, hopefully. Stay healthy, and good luck to everybody, your staff at Global Institute for Tomorrow, closer with you guys to shape a better world. Thank you very much. Selamat sore dan sukses untuk kita semua.
Terima kasih, Pak. Terima kasih. Thank you very much. Take care of yourself and good luck to everybody in Indonesia. Be safe.
Terima kasih, Pak. Thank you.